April 8th, 2026. 1,710 Russian soldiers were gone in a single day. Not a week.
Not a month.
One day. And the weapon responsible was not a missile. It was not an airstrike. It was something far cheaper, far deadlier, and far more unstoppable than anything Putin prepared for when he launched this war. Let that sink in for a moment. 1,710 human beings
Annihilated.
before midnight. And here is the part that nobody is talking about. That record-breaking single-day massacre was not the story. It was a symptom. The real story is what is happening underneath the numbers. A slow-motion collapse that is accelerating faster than any military analyst predicted. Something is wiping out Russian forces in Ukraine on a scale never seen before in modern warfare. And it is not slowing down. It is not stabilizing. Every single data point we have says the same thing. It is getting worse. Fast. I have been watching this war since day one. And what I am seeing right now on April 8th, 2026 is different. The machinery behind these losses is something unprecedented. And once I show you how it actually works, you will never look at this conflict the same way again. Most channels will give you the casualty numbers. They will read you the headlines. They will tell you Russia is losing and Ukraine is holding the line. And then they will move on. I am not going to do that. In this video, I am going to give you the full picture. Not just the numbers on the surface, but I am going to show you why 89,000 confirmed casualties in 3 months is actually the most optimistic version of Russia's reality. I am going to show you the economic death spiral that is feeding this war from the inside and eating Russia alive in the process. And I am going to walk you through the scenario that intelligence analysts are quietly watching right now. The one that no mainstream outlet has the courage to lay out plainly. 3 layers of information, each one more consequential than the last. By the end of this, you will not just understand what is happening, you will understand where this is going. Let us start with the number that broke the internet.
89,000.
That is the official count of Russian casualties confirmed during the first quarter of 2026. 3 months. 89,000 soldiers gone. That figure came directly from Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky during a press conference at the end of March. And before you dismiss it as wartime propaganda, understand what confirmed actually means in this context. Because that word is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, and most people completely miss it. Confirmed means verified. It means Ukraine has video evidence, drone footage, battlefield documentation. It means a body, a vehicle, a position that can be proven destroyed beyond reasonable doubt. What it does not mean is complete. And that distinction is everything. Here is what the head of Ukraine's unmanned systems forces, Robert Brovdy, actually said. 20% of the strikes that Ukraine carried out during the first 3 months of 2026 cannot be fully verified in terms of the human cost. Think about what that means. Ukraine knows the strikes landed. The drones confirm the hits. But when a single drone strike detonates inside a concentration of troops, the shrapnel does not stop at one body. It does not file a report. The soldiers who die indirectly, the ones buried under rubble, the ones killed by secondary explosions, the ones who bleed out beyond the camera's reach, they do not make it into that 89,000 figure. They simply disappear. So when you hear 89,000, understand that you are hearing the floor, not the ceiling. The real number is higher. How much higher is something that even Ukraine cannot say with precision. But the directional signal is unmistakable. Russia's actual casualties in the first quarter of 2026 almost certainly push past 6 figures when you account for what the cameras cannot see. Now let us talk about what Russia got in return for those 89,000 confirmed dead. In all of 2025, Putin fed approximately 400,000 of Russia's soldiers into Ukraine. 400,000 human beings consumed by a single year of war. And what did that purchase? 4,336 square kilometers of Ukrainian territory. That sounds significant until you realize it represents 0.72% of Ukraine's total landmass, a country that Russia still needs to conquer 80% of. At that rate, as the Institute for the Study of War has calculated, Russia would need a century to complete what Putin called a special military operation. A century. Putin would be long dead. His successors would be long dead, and Russian soldiers would still be dying in Ukrainian fields. But here is where it gets worse. That rate of territorial gain is not holding. It is collapsing. Between October 2025 and March 2026, Russia seized approximately 1,930 square kilometers of Ukraine. Compare that to the same 6-month window 1 year earlier, between 2024 and 2025, when Russia captured 2,716 square kilometers. That is a 30% reduction in the rate of advance. Russia is slowing down while the casualties are speeding up. Let that combination settle in your mind for a moment. Now let us do the mathematics that Putin does not want anyone doing. If we take the casualty figures across that same 6-month period, accounting for the overlap between the two reporting windows and subtracting the double-counted month of January, we arrive at approximately 184,000 Russian casualties between October 2025 and March 2026. Divide 184,000 casualties by 745 square miles gained, and you get a figure that should end careers in the Kremlin. Russia is losing 247 soldiers for every single square mile of Ukrainian territory it captures. 247 lives for 1 square mile of a country it still controls less than 20% of. This is not a military campaign. This is a demographic catastrophe dressed up in military language. This is the generational destruction of an entire population in exchange for patches of land that will not change the outcome of this war. And on March 17th, 2026, that catastrophe reached a single-day peak of 1,710 confirmed casualties. To put that in perspective, the United States lost 2,446 soldiers across the entirety of its 20-year war in Afghanistan. Russia is now replicating that level of loss roughly every day and a half. Russia fought its own war in Afghanistan across an entire decade and lost 15,000 soldiers. In Ukraine, Russia is burning through that same number every 2 weeks. These are not statistics. They are a verdict, and the verdict is still being written. Now, here is where I need you to pay very close attention, because everything I just showed you, the 89,000, the 247 soldiers per square mile, the record single-day losses, all of that is the visible part of this collapse. What I am about to show you is the part that is happening underneath. The mechanism, the self-destroying machine that Putin built and can no longer switch off. For the first time since Russia launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022, something has shifted at a fundamental level. Russia's arrivals to departures balance has turned negative 4 consecutive months. December 2025, January 2026, February 2026, March 2026. 4 straight months where Russia is losing more soldiers than it is replacing. This has never happened before in this war, and it is not a blip. It is a trend. And trends in warfare do not reverse themselves without a dramatic intervention that Putin currently does not have available to him. Let us look at the math on the recruitment side. Russia set a target of 409,000 new soldiers by the end of 2026. After the first quarter, Russia should be 25% of the way toward that goal. It is not. Russia has recruited approximately 80,000 new soldiers, which is 22% of the annual target. 3 percentage points behind schedule after just 3 months. That gap sounds small. It is not. Because on the other side of the ledger, 89,000 confirmed casualties already exceeds those 80,000 recruits. Russia is not just falling behind its targets. It is running a deficit in human capital that is widening every single week. And here is the trap that Putin built for himself that nobody in mainstream media is explaining clearly enough. The mechanism works like this. Russia needs to attack to justify the war politically at home. Attacking produces casualties. Casualties require replacements. Replacements require money and willing bodies. The money is running out. The willing bodies are disappearing. So Russia attacks harder to try to produce results faster, which produces more casualties, which deepens the deficit, which forces more desperate recruitment measures, which destabilizes the domestic economy, which reduces the money available for recruitment incentives, which makes fewer people willing to fight. This is not a military problem with a military solution. This is a closed-loop system consuming itself from the inside. Now let us talk about what Russia is actually doing to try to break out of that loop, because this is where it goes from catastrophic to something closer to medieval. The cash incentive model that Russia used to fill its ranks through 2022, 2023, and 2024 is visibly breaking down. In some Russian regions during the early years of the war, sign-on bonuses reached as high as $40,000. That was real money in a country where the average monthly wage sits well below $1,000. Men took the deal. They calculated the odds. Some of them decided the money was worth the risk. But that calculation is changing. Word travels. Casualty rates are becoming impossible to hide, even inside Russia's tightly controlled information environment. And the regions that were bankrolling those bonuses are running dry. Multiple Russian regions are now cutting the size of their recruitment bonuses because they simply do not have the budget to maintain them. The financial incentive that drove voluntary recruitment is deflating at exactly the moment when Russia needs it to be at its most powerful. So what does a regime do when the market for soldiers collapses? It stops asking and starts demanding. In the Ryazan region of Russia, local authorities have issued orders requiring businesses to participate directly in military recruitment. Any company with between 150 and 500 employees must submit names of workers considered suitable for frontline service by September of 2026. Companies with between 150 and 300 employees must provide 2 candidates. Companies with between 300 and 500 must provide 5. Businesses that refuse face fines of 1 million rubles, which converts to just over $12,000. Read that again slowly. The Russian state is now ordering private employers to identify their own workers and hand them to the military. This is not recruitment. This is conscription wearing a suit. And it does not stop there. Russia's Minister of Education and Science, Valery Falkov, has issued directives ordering universities across Russia to convince 2% of their student populations to enlist voluntarily. If fully implemented, this would generate approximately 44,000 new soldiers from universities alone, or as many as 76,000 if colleges are included alongside universities. Intelligence analysts are looking at this particular measure very carefully because of what it signals beyond the numbers. You do not go after your student population unless you have exhausted every other option. Students are not soldiers. They are the economic foundation of whatever comes after this war. Pulling them out of universities and pointing them at Ukrainian drone kill zones is not a recruitment strategy. It is an act of economic self-harm that Russia will be paying for across the next 2 decades. And this brings us to the dimension of this collapse that almost nobody is connecting to the battlefield picture. The labor crisis inside Russia is not separate from the military crisis. They are the same crisis wearing different faces. Over 20 factories in the Leningrad region alone have shifted to 3-day working weeks, not because demand for their products has fallen, but because the workforce that used to run those factories has been absorbed by the war machine. Russia is pulling workers off production lines to fill body bags on Ukrainian front lines, and then discovering that it does not have anyone left to run the factories that build the equipment those soldiers need. Think about what that means structurally. Russia is simultaneously destroying its military manpower, its industrial workforce, and its future educated class. 3 pillars of national power, eroding in parallel. War say, war at accelerating speed. Historians who study the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 will recognize this pattern immediately. The Soviet Union did not fall because it lost a war. It fell because the economic cost of maintaining a military empire finally exceeded what the underlying economy could sustain. Putin spent 25 years presenting himself as the man who prevented that collapse from happening again. What the data from the first quarter of 2026 is beginning to suggest is that he may have simply delayed it while making it considerably worse. The drone economy that Ukraine has built is the accelerant nobody planned for. By the end of 2025, Ukraine was manufacturing 4 million drones per year. 4 million. The kill zones that those drones patrol are now tripling in size due to the introduction of medium-range strike systems that can reach further behind Russian lines than ever before. Russia is not facing a static defensive line. It is facing an industrialized death machine that gets cheaper, smarter, and more lethal with every passing month. And unlike Russian soldiers, Ukrainian drones do not need signing bonuses. They do not need to be convinced. They do not have families watching casualty figures on Telegram. They simply fly, and they do not stop. Now I need to bring this closer to home, because everything I have just shown you is not happening in a vacuum on the other side of the world. The collapse I am describing has consequences that extend far beyond Ukrainian fields and Russian recruitment offices. And most people are not connecting the dots between what is happening on that front line and what is coming for the rest of us. Let us start with the threshold that changes everything. Zelensky has stated publicly that 50,000 Russian casualties per month is the number. That is the rate of attrition that his military believes will force Putin into one of two choices: either come to the negotiating table or trigger a level of domestic mobilization inside Russia that his own population will not tolerate. Right now, Russia is sitting at approximately 30,000 confirmed casualties per month. That sounds far from 50,000 until you look at the trajectory. In the 4 days leading up to March 23rd, Russia attempted over 600 assaults against Ukrainian positions and lost 6,090 soldiers in the process. That is over 1,500 casualties per day. Multiply that by 30 days, and Russia's monthly losses veer dangerously close to 46,000. Putin is not approaching that 50,000 threshold gradually. He is accelerating toward it, and here is where the butterfly effect begins. If Russia crosses that threshold while its recruitment deficit continues to widen, Putin faces a choice that has no good answer. Option 1 is full-scale mandatory mobilization, not the partial mobilization of September 2022 that sent hundreds of thousands of Russian men fleeing across borders into Georgia, Kazakhstan, and Finland overnight. Full mobilization, the kind that cannot be hidden behind euphemisms and state media framing. The kind that shows up at your door. Intelligence analysts are looking at internal Kremlin signaling very carefully right now because the groundwork for exactly this scenario is already being laid. Putin signed legislation in 2025 transforming Russia's conscription system from 2 annual drafts into a continuous year-round call-up of anyone aged between 18 and 30. That law did not exist for decoration. It exists because someone in Moscow was already planning for this moment. Now think about what mandatory mobilization inside Russia means for the rest of the world. The last time Putin announced even a partial mobilization, global energy markets moved. The ruble collapsed. European governments convened emergency sessions. Capital fled Russia at a pace that its central bank struggled to contain. A full mobilization announcement would be an order of magnitude larger in its psychological and economic shockwave. Oil markets, already sensitive to any signal from Moscow, would reprice overnight. Supply chains that still run through or adjacent to Russian-controlled territory would face new pressure. And the governments of NATO's eastern flank, from Finland to Poland to the Baltic states, would be forced into a level of military readiness that carries its own economic cost for their citizens. But there is a second option Putin is considering that is in some ways even more dangerous. And this is the scenario that almost nobody is discussing openly. If Putin cannot mobilize without triggering domestic unrest that threatens his grip on power, and if the volunteer recruitment model continues to collapse, he may attempt to reduce the intensity of frontline assaults while shifting to a strategy of long-range attrition through drone and missile strikes deep inside Ukrainian territory. The calculation would be to preserve manpower by pulling back from the most costly ground assaults while continuing to inflict pain from a distance. And it sounds rational on paper. But here is the problem with that logic. Ukraine is producing 4 million drones per year, and those numbers are growing. Ukrainian long-range strikes are already reaching oil refineries, export terminals, and military logistics nodes deep inside Russian territory. If Russia reduces its ground pressure, Ukraine does not stand still. It accelerates its own deep strike campaign. Russia would be choosing between bleeding fast on the ground or bleeding slower from the air, while its economic infrastructure continues to erode. There is no clean exit from this machine. That is what the data is telling us. And then there is the factor that nobody has fully priced in yet. The variable that could tilt this entire equation in a direction that makes everything I have described look like a warm-up act. Ukraine is not standing still on the technology front. The drone kill zones that are already tripling in size are about to get a new dimension added to them, a capability that intelligence analysts are describing in terms that sound closer to science fiction than conventional warfare. If this system deploys at scale before Russia can develop a meaningful counter, the already catastrophic exchange ratios we have been discussing today will shift into territory that no Kremlin planner has a model for. The butterfly has already flapped its wings. What we are watching now is the storm beginning to form. So let us bring everything together. And I want you to hold all of it in your mind at once. 89,000 confirmed Russian soldiers gone in 3 months, a number that is almost certainly understating the true cost by tens of thousands. 247 lives spent for every single square mile of Ukrainian territory captured. A recruitment system running 4 consecutive months in the negative for the first time since this war began. Factories shutting down to 3-day work weeks. Universities being ordered to funnel students into body bags. Regional governments running out of the money they once used to convince men to die voluntarily. A spring offensive ramping up that is pushing daily casualties toward numbers that would have seemed impossible 12 months ago. This is not a military campaign that is struggling. This is a system that is consuming itself, and the consumption is accelerating. But here is the question that I cannot answer for you today, and it is the only question that actually matters right now. Before this machine finishes destroying itself, what is Putin willing to do? A man who has spent 25 years building and protecting his grip on power is now watching that power base erode from 2 directions simultaneously. The battlefield is eating his army, and the domestic pressure of feeding that battlefield is eating his economy and his population's patience. History tells us that leaders in this position do not go quietly. They do not sit down at a negotiating table and accept terms that look like defeat. They reach for something. And what Putin reaches for in the coming months is the variable that every government in Europe, every energy market, every defense planner on the planet is watching right now with a level of anxiety that is not yet fully reflected in the news cycle you are consuming. We are not at the end of this story. We are at the moment just before the next chapter begins. And that chapter is going to move fast. If you want to be ahead of it rather than blindsided by it, subscribe now. Because the next piece of this puzzle, the weapon Ukraine is deploying that could make everything you just watched look like the opening act, that is coming next. Do not miss it.